Good afternoon to everybody who has joined us. Welcome at the Brussels campus of Maastricht University, and welcome to this online book presentation, Hitler's Cosmopolitan Bastard, Count Richard Coudenhove-Kalergie and His Visions of Europe, authored by Martyn Bond, with the assistance of Claudia Hamill, who amongst others supported him with the analysis of primary sources that were used for this book. Well, it's a pleasure to having you here, even if we cannot meet physically for the moment in Brussels. Before giving the floor to Martyn for his 30-minute presentation, I first would like to present both Martyn Bond and Claudia Hamill to you and say a few words also about how we are going to proceed. Most of us are already more than happy if we can manage one career. Martyn Bond actually enjoyed three. He has been an academic, a BBC correspondent to Berlin, and a European civil servant. He was, amongst others, the head of the European Parliament Information Service in London. Currently, he is a distinguished senior fellow of Regent's University London, and he advises the University of Surrey's Jean Monnet Centre of Excellence. Claudia Hamill directs the Fondation Erland in Brussels and is a senior advisor to the European Forum for Manufacturing. She also had a very varied career, working primarily with the EU institutions. Claudia also has a link with Maastricht University, where she has previously been visiting fellow on the EU and communication. And I can testify that our students were always keen to learn from her rich Brussels experience. My name is Sophie Vanhoonacker. I'm based at the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at Maastricht University, where I'm a professor in administrative governance, and I will be moderating this debate. We will proceed as follows. Martyn Bond will start with his 30-minute presentation on some of the key findings of his exciting book, supported by a PowerPoint presentation. And successively, Claudia Hamill will share some of her own insights and comments. And afterwards, we will open the floor for questions and comments. The questions can be put on the chat, so you can already start writing on the chat during the presentation if you want. And it's important perhaps also to know that this session will be recorded. So, well, I would like to pass the floor to Martyn.
Thank you very much indeed, Sophie. Thank you very much. I really want to talk to you all today about an Austro-Hungarian count who is, I think, unjustly neglected in European circles. Hitler violently disagreed with him and called him a cosmopolitan bastard. The Count challenged Hitler with an alternative vision for the future of Europe in the 1920s and 30s, not racial domination, but international cooperation. And the Count has been more influential long-term in shaping the Europe we live in than he's generally given credit for. Let me show you the first slide. There we are. This is Richard Count Coudenhove-Kalergie, born in Tokyo 1894, died in Austria 1972, buried in Switzerland. A word first about his background and then about why we should remember him better. Next slide. These are his parents, an ill-assorted couple, you might think. Heinrich, a gifted Austro-Hungarian diplomat, and Mitsu, the beautiful daughter of a well-to-do shopkeeper in Tokyo. An unlikely match, you might think, and it was. Heinrich simply purchased her from her father as his concubine 2 weeks after he arrived in Japan. Not actually an uncommon practice at the time, however shocking it may seem now. But after she produced 2 sons, Heinrich then married Mitsu to secure an inheritance back in Europe, where his father had just died. Then he legitimized the children, brought the family home so that he could enjoy his estates in Bohemia. Heinrich died, however, only about 10 years later, when Richard, the son with whom we're concerned, was about 12, and the boy was sent to the prestigious international boarding school in Vienna, the Theresianum, as were his brothers. He left school in 1913, an auspicious year, and before going to university, he met the woman who was to be the love of his life, the leading actress of the Viennese stage at the time, Ida Roland. She was 13 years older than he was, and he was just 18. This Ida was only 8 years younger than his mother, and the relationship led to a serious break with his aristocratic family. In 1914, he was declared exempt from the draft in the First World War on account of dubiously weak lungs. He continued his studies at university and gained a doctorate in philosophy in 1917. At the end of the war, he devised a plan to encourage the new states created by the Versailles Treaty to cooperate together. He did not want them to fight, just as the old empires had done. Next slide, please. This gentleman, whom some of you may recognize, is Thomas Garrigue Masaryk, the first president of the newly created Czechoslovakia. He was one of the key players in the drive towards national self-determination in Central and Eastern Europe. And in 1919, young Richard Coudenhove-Kalergie became a Czech citizen because the family castle in Bohemia, part of the Sudetenland, was in the territory of that new state. And it was to Masaryk that he went with his first ideas about restructuring Europe. To ensure peace among the new states, Richard explained to Masaryk what he needed was European states to form a single unit, to be able to speak for themselves as one rather than as many small states in the newly created League of Nations. But Masaryk replied, nationalism, he knew, was too strong in those new states, that it could not be shared in that way, in the way that Coudenhove was suggesting, at least not yet. So let's see the next slide, which is where Coudenhove took his idea next. If individual states would not turn his plan for cooperation into reality, then Coudenhove-Kalergie persuaded himself that the League of Nations would be the best place. The League was an early version of the United Nations. It's a simple comparison, a grand idea for global cooperation. And Coudenhove wanted to make it concentrate on regional, let's say European peace. But while the League could overawe small states, it was run actually by the big states, just like the Security Council does today in the UN. Mussolini aptly described it as, and I quote, good when the sparrows chatter, useless when the eagles scream. Its secretariat was firmly in the hands of the British, and when Coudenhove took his idea of a European Union within the League to the British Secretary General, Sir Eric Drummond, he was advised, quote, not to push his ideas too far or too fast. Incidentally, the Deputy Secretary General at that time was a certain Jean Monnet, to whom we shall refer again a little later. But now, however, the young Count turned to another young leader to try and put his ideas into practice. He turned to Mussolini. Next slide. Here is the young Mussolini, or youngish Mussolini. In the 1920s, this man was a political phenomenon. With very clever use of mass media and propaganda and command of the street, Mussolini seized power in Italy with the Black Shirts' march on Rome in October 1922. Since Masaryk had turned him down and Sir Eric Drummond had shut the door of the League in his face, Richard Coudenhove-Kalergie now appealed to Mussolini to take up his ideas. He wrote him an open letter, published in the press in Austria and in Italy, asking him to call a mega conference of all European states in Rome to agree mutual disarmament, economic cooperation, and a common external tariff. That way, Europe would project its united power outwards towards the rest of the world and would become a force that mattered, not just a collection of small states. Mussolini, not surprisingly, did not even deign to reply to this idealistic, rather public, and rather slightly foolish or naive invitation from an outsider who was frankly unknown at that time. Next slide, please. So the young Count decided he needed to be known. So what he decided to do was to write his own program and lead his own political movement. He put his ideas down on paper and self-published Pan-Europa in October 1923. It was a stunning success. Within a year, it sold over 20,000 copies, which at the time was a remarkable figure. The following year, the first translations appeared. It got positive reviews from the liberal press across the continent and was damned by nationalists on the right and by communists on the left. In his book, the Count appealed to the youth of Europe to make a reality out of his dream to unite Europe internally by consent among all the nations and to project European values outside across the rest of the world. Next slide, please. The Count's book is essentially about geopolitics. Now, this is a much abused term, but rough definition is really how political power is determined by geographical factors. And he would have added also by cultural and historical factors too. The difference between the Count and other thinkers of the time is that the Count did not start with a single nation, like Germany, centrally located, and extrapolate its possibilities in its region. He started with the concept of the whole continent, with Europe, and sought to enhance its role in the world. And at that level, he identified 5 power centers, which are reflected in this map. The shading's not easy to see, but I hope I can explain them as we go. On the left, except for Canada, you have Pan America. That's the whole of the United States, Mexico, and all the states of South America. It was the most developed part of the world at the time, independent from the old powers of Europe and not in any way affected negatively by being fought over as in the First World War. Then to the right, of course, you have the Soviet Union, which Lenin had only just united after the Civil War. It sought to spread its ideology worldwide by subverting the capitalist system through the Comintern, which was established that same year, 2022, I believe, sorry, the Communist International. Then came, of course, the British Empire, which at that time still ruled over a quarter of the world's population, including the whole of the Indian subcontinent, Australia, Canada, South Africa, and much, much more. Then there was, in Coudenhove's eyes, a rather amorphous entity, which he called the Asian Power Center, including China, Japan, and Korea. And finally, the European Power Center that he conjured up in his book. This is Pan-Europa, the dark shading, the black parts of the map, from the Arctic North through the whole of the European continent to its colonies in North and West Africa, plus Madagascar, Indonesia, Vietnam, the neighboring states of Southeast Asia. Together they made up a European empire, nearly as populous as the empire that Britain then ruled. Now today, of course, decolonization has changed that aspect of the picture considerably. The British Empire is history, but 3 major power centers remain: America, Russia, China, and potentially a 4th, the European Union. Next slide, please. This is, again, a large gathering. The Count and his actress wife, Ida Rowland, were extraordinarily successful networkers, and with her stage reputation and his political best-selling book, they had become European celebrities. Their first Pan-Europa Congress opened in Vienna in October 1926 with a performance of Beethoven's Ode to Joy, the first time the music, that music would become the European anthem used in an event such as this. Over 2,000 of Europe's cultural and political elite from more than 20 countries cheered and applauded, among them Thomas Mann, Sigmund Freud, Albert Einstein. They mingled, networked, listened to speeches from leading politicians, the young Count among them, attended the gala performance in the Burg Theater, where Ida Rowland played a leading role, held their final banquet in the Schönbrunn Palace, which the Austrian government had opened up especially for the occasion, the first time since the end of the war. Richard summed it up. For 3 days, Vienna was the capital of Europe. Next slide, please. Among the political leaders that the Count impressed were 2 that mattered more than most: Aristide Briand, on the left here, the Prime Minister in Paris, and Gustav Stresemann, the Foreign Minister in Berlin. If the Count could reconcile French and German interests after the horrors of the First World War, the way would be open for his wider idea of European Union, from Portugal to Poland, from Amsterdam to Athens. The Count had already met Gustav Stresemann in 1925 and made a positive impression then. Stresemann noted in his diary, the young Count was, quote, a man of extraordinary knowledge and great energy. I'm convinced he's going to play a great role. After the success of the Count's Pan-Europa Congress the following year, Aristide Briand became honorary president of the Count's political movement, the spin-off from Pan-Europa, the Pan-Europa Union. 3 years later, Briand himself took a French plan to the League of Nations, loosely based on Pan-Europa's vision. He proposed a sort of federal link between neighboring states on the European continent. Most other leaders, including Stresemann, thought this was a good idea. But events contrived to frustrate it. First, the Wall Street crash that same year ushered in the Great Depression. To solve the credit crunch and the unemployment crisis, states turned inwards and erected barriers to international trade. Self-sufficiency and competition became the rule. Interdependence was out. On the back of this, the Nazis gained support and came to power in Germany by the end of January 1933. They immediately banned Pan-Europa, seized its assets, and burnt the Count's books. Next slide, please. The Count and his wife fell back on Austria. and concentrated on frustrating Nazi plans for German expansion. From their grand apartment, this marvelous building on the left here, which was the old prior's apartment in a beautifully well-preserved part of central Vienna, from this grand apartment, aptly styled at the time the Embassy of Pan-Europa, they organized innumerable conferences for the states of Eastern and Central Europe to encourage cooperation against German domination. But despite their best efforts and the efforts of the Austrian chancellors Dollfuss and Schuschnigg, who supported them, they failed. In March 38, Germany marched into Austria and they fled. This plaque on the right, you can just see easily the words Richard Graf Coudenhove-Kalergie. This plaque records their dramatic escape from Vienna that night. With the Gestapo in hot pursuit, the Count and his wife crossed the border into Czechoslovakia and finally, by a roundabout route, reached their country house in neutral Switzerland. Next slide, please. Thank you. Here is the Count, not quite so young now, in his mid-40s, at the foreground on the right here, with Ida seated beside him, and her daughter by her first marriage, Erika, whom the Count had adopted. In my biography, I recount a delightful story about how they discovered this house in the country and bought it, then added little pieces of adjoining land, so it had a really large garden, and it was a piece of the Swiss countryside. Richard greatly admired Switzerland, and not surprisingly, it was a federally organized state in which both Catholics and Protestants, French, German, Italian-speaking citizens, rural and urban cantons all lived peacefully together. Just what he wanted Europeans to do on a larger scale. And from here, throughout 1938, 39, and during the phony war of 1940, he and his wife traveled to wherever they could to encourage resistance to the Nazis and their plans. He was often in London, met Churchill there and visited him in his country house in Chartwell. He spoke several times at Chatham House and organized pan-Europa events in Paris, Brussels, and The Hague. Next slide, please. When Hollywood, this is something of a sidestep, but when Hollywood later made Casablanca, a very well-known film, obviously, the Count was the model for the Czech resistance hero, Victor Laszlo. You can probably see him. He's just behind Ingrid Bergman on the left-hand side there, above the barrel of the revolver. The husband of Victor Laszlo is the husband of the heroine in the play, and he organizes the singing of the Marseillaise in Rick's bar. Those of you who've seen the play will remember this extremely moving scene where the Marseillaise totally disrupts the Germans who are trying to sing Die Wacht am Rhein. But for the Count, the war was actually no fiction at all. He was a wanted man. He escaped again in June 1940, just as the German army broke through France. He finally reached Lisbon, where he applied for visas both to Britain and to the United States. And next slide, please. The British delayed for unexplained security reasons, but the Americans whisked him and his family to freedom in New York on board this Yankee Clipper, the most luxurious and the most expensive flying boat of its day. It's still not clear who found the several thousands of dollars to pay for the 3 refugees to get to New York, and then to rent their upmarket flat there with a view over the Hudson River. But Coudenhove-Kalergie certainly made his mark in America. In New York, he spoke at the Council of Foreign Relations and at International House, encouraging America to join the war against the Nazis. He was pleading the British cause, which in his eyes was also the European cause. It was vital to keep Britain out of the clutches of the Nazis, just as later it would be vital to keep as much as possible of Europe out of the clutches of the Soviets. He saw them both as threats to civilization, threats to the values of the West, not just threats to territory. Next slide, please. All this was music, of course, to Churchill's ears. The Count kept him informed about what he was doing and saying in America. He sent short messages congratulating him on British victories, like El Alamein in 1942, for instance. He sent Churchill articles that he published in American newspapers. In 1943, he organized the 5th Pan-Europa Congress in New York University, where he'd been given the teaching post 2 years earlier, and he sent the results to Churchill. They included a draft constitution for the United States of Europe after victory in the war. A steady stream of cables and letters went to 10 Downing Street. The Count also wrote the first of his 5 autobiographies while he was in New York. Called The Crusade for Pan-Europa, Autobiography of a Man and a Movement, it was his first attempt to tell his own story the way he wanted others to see it. just like Churchill would do once the war was over. But the Count's message didn't go down well with President Roosevelt, because he would not hide his anti-Soviet views. For Roosevelt, Stalin was a vital ally right up to the end of the war. It was only when President Truman, next slide please, when President Truman took over that the Count got through to the heart of the American administration. He networked so well that both the Secretary of State Marshall and the President accorded him private interviews. This half-Japanese Count, who'd objected to fighting in the First World War, got along famously with the President who just dropped the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and who thought that the United States of Europe was, quote, an excellent idea, said Truman. And he left his mark on the Marshall Plan for European reconstruction, making sure that it was a condition of American aid that European states had to coordinate their requests rather than all coming begging one by one for American aid. Back in Europe in 1946, the Count polled 4,000 parliamentarians from all the democratically elected parliaments of Europe for their views on the United States of Europe. He got an overwhelmingly positive response and invited 200 of them to meet here in the Gstaad Palace Hotel. If I change the slide, please. Slide, thank you. Here, this magnificent great hotel in Gstaad was where they met in 1947, not very far from his country house. And they met in order to form the European Parliamentary Union, or EPU. It was a pressure group of MPs in each parliament, ready to push their governments along the road toward union. They demanded an elected parliament for Europe, with the power to draft a federal constitution. Next slide, please. And the indefatigable Count continued to advise Churchill, notably just before his famous Zurich speech in September 46, when Churchill acknowledged his debt to the Count and called for a kind of United States of Europe. 2 years later, the Count was at this event, the Congress of Europe in The Hague, and was the next speaker after Churchill at the opening ceremony. Where Churchill was seen very much as the liberator of the continent, the Count was widely recognized as the grandfather of Europe. Next slide, please. Within 2 years of that event, the Count's brainchild and creation, the EPU, achieved a great success. The Council of Europe was set up in August 1949. An integral part of the Council was a parliamentary assembly, the very first form of European Parliament. This plaque on the left shows where the Council of Europe first met, in the University of Strasbourg, because there was no other building big enough at the time. And quite rightly, there's a bust of the Count on the wall outside the main committee rooms of the new purpose-built headquarters of the Council, the Palais de l'Europe, alongside that of Adenauer. You can see it between the number 7, Coudenhove a bit dark, this side, Adenauer just beyond. For 2 years, the Parliamentary Assembly was chaired by Paul Henry Spark, who tried his best to persuade governments to grant the Assembly the right to draft a constitution, but in vain. The British government especially dug its heels in and refused. The Europe that Britain wanted was based on intergovernmental assent, not supranational parliamentary initiative. Yet when the Iron Curtain eventually fell, it was to the Council of Europe and its Parliamentary Assembly that the newly liberated countries of Central and Eastern Europe first delegated parliamentarians, long before their governments qualified to join the European Union. Next slide, please. It's hardly surprising that the Count was the first recipient of the Charlemagne Prize, awarded for his outstanding contribution to European unification by the city of Aachen in May 1950. Here he is, proudly wearing the medal on his chest with Ida by his side. Churchill was awarded the prize in 56, Paul Henry Spark in 57. In the early 50s, however, Churchill returned to power in the UK and bent his efforts on defeating socialism in Britain. He grew less and less concerned about European unity when he was once more Prime Minister of his country. Next slide, please. Coudenhove-Kalergie turned away from Churchill during these years and towards de Gaulle. They corresponded at length, and soon after he came back into power in 1958, the general put his friend on the presidential payroll. He also helped to finance further pan-Europa congresses in Paris and Vienna. It was a strange friendship, each man appreciating the strengths of the other. The Count offered advice essentially on European and international affairs, and the president appreciated Coudenhove's independence and breadth of vision. He helped the president by floating ideas in the media, acting as his unofficial channel for initiatives, and warning of potential political fallout from his private vantage point. They exchanged books and wrote personal dedications in them, and the Count was genuinely grief-stricken when the president resigned in 1969, and even more so when he died the following year. Next slide, please. Jean Monnet. The Count's relationship with Jean Monnet was quite different. It ran at the same time as the 50s and 60s relationship with the general, but it was much more a question of rivalry, really. André Fontaine, the editor of Le Monde, called Jean Monnet the father of Europe and the Count the grandfather, since he'd started the project so much earlier. Monnet and the Count did meet on a few occasions, but even if their ultimate goal was political union for Europe, their correspondence reveals serious differences in their approach. Monnet's practical method was strong on collaboration among multi-party groups and interests. He identified specific advantages, searching for compromise. Coudenhove-Kalergie's intellectual approach was less collaborative, searched out the big picture and left all the tedious detail to negotiation at some lower level. For him, it was big issues that needed to be settled: security, leadership, legitimacy, identity. Monnet's community method has brought the EU a long way, but now it seems the big issues are crowding in again. Next slide, please. The Count died in July 1972, as I mentioned, a few weeks after the UK Parliament voted overwhelmingly to join the European communities. He was buried in a private graveyard at the bottom of the garden of his country house in Switzerland. There's, of course, a great deal more in the book, but I hope this quick journey through the main events of his life and his big ideas has whetted your appetite and maybe suggested a few questions. I hope I've given you an idea of why he matters today. These big issues are back on the agenda. The Conference on the Future of Europe has just opened. It's a 2-year consultation about where Europe should go from here and how. I trust that those who want to contribute to that will brush up on their knowledge of Richard Coudenhove-Kalergie. I think it will help. Thank you very much. I know my colleague indeed wants to say something, so Claudia, so I would, at the end we can both take questions, but I will hand you back now to the chairman. Thank you.
Well, many thanks, Martyn, for a very exciting presentation. I think it's very clear that we cannot capture the thinking and the personality of Coudenhove-Kalergie in just a few words. So I think, well, I can imagine you needed a full book to do so. And I can also imagine that the study of Coudenhove-Kalergie brought you to many interesting places. If you see how much this man has traveled, how many people he has been meeting. So I'm sure you and Claudia, you discovered a lot of interesting archives. So, perhaps we can also discuss a little bit more about the whole trajectory of the book in the Q&A afterwards. And I now pass the floor to Claudia Hamill.
Thank you very much. Sophie, I'm so pleased to be returning to the University of Maastricht and its Brussels campus, even if it's virtually. And thank you also to Tatiana for organising this. You can't see it, she's not visible, but she's doing all the slides and organising the technical side. As Sophie said, I was a visiting fellow at the university, and I concentrated on the master's module on the idea of getting your message across. And that was about relationships between and with the EU institutions. Now, Richard Count Coudenhove-Kalergie, Hitler's cosmopolitan bastard, was an expert at getting his message across. And he only really had one message, many iterations, but only one message. And incidentally, cosmopolitan in those days, when Hitler wrote about him in Mein Kampf, was also a derogatory word, a kind of code word for internationally minded people, and his wife, and Jewish people. And his wife, first wife, Ida Roland, was actually Jewish. And so I'm going to pick up first on the Count getting his message across, just a couple of examples, developing on what Martyn's already said. And secondly, on the relationship with Monnet. So turning first to getting his message across, I'm going to have to use RCK. Martyn and I found that trying to say Richard Coudenhove-Kalergie several times in one conversation, or indeed in one bit of writing, was just too much. And so we used RCK, and I was delighted to find that actually in several letters he signed off using that RCK. So one early example of his understanding the importance of getting this message across was illustrated at that first Pan-Europa Congress. Martyn talked about the open ceremony and the organ playing Beethoven's Ode to Joy. And while this was being played, very, very slowly, the Pan-Europa flag was being raised, very dramatic moment. And that Pan-Europa flag, the yellow circle and the red cross on the book cover you saw, hung from every street corner in Vienna during that time, and it flew at all his subsequent events. He was a very good orator and had a great sense of drama, and he showed this again in 1947. He insisted on holding a press conference at the top of a mountain summit, and he persuaded journalists, this was in Switzerland, to get into chairlifts to get there. He was brilliant at public relations. He understood the importance of asking a question which ensures the right answer. In the age of no email and no internet access for these address lists, he personally signed those 3,919 letters, Martyn, not quite 4,000, and RCK was very precise, to these European parliamentarians, with a return address card which said, "Are you in favour of the establishment of a European Federation within the framework of the United Nations? Answer, yes or no," in caps. You can imagine that he actually got an answer. He says 90% yes. Actually, it's 90% of those who answered, but he was ever the self-publicist. The European passport, the European currency, the European day, not the one that we've got now, but another one, the European army. These were all his ideas, as was the Charter of Human Rights adopted by the successor to his European Parliamentary Union, the Council of Europe. So I'm now going to focus on Monet at RCK. And after all, I know it's Maastricht, but it's also the Brussels campus. We have to think about Monet. And we think about him, of course, as the architect or one of them of the EU. And indeed, anyone studying history of the EU is aware of his key role. I certainly was aware that my students knew it. Martyn indicated their rivalry. They both starved each other of the oxygen of publicity. And so it took us some time to establish the detailed reality of their relationship. What I'm going to do is to first look at the two men, the kind of compare and contrast, the basis of so many student essays. Secondly, what ideas they shared and where they diverged. And finally, the comparative high points in their careers. Well, compare and contrast. Physically, they couldn't have been more different. Martyn opens the chapter on Monet and RCK, the one-headed Europe's father and Europe's grandfather, with a quote from André Fontaine, editor of Le Monde at the time. And Fontaine went on to describe Monet's appearance as his idea of Hercule Poirot, the Belgian detective of Agatha Christie's crime novels, rather short and squat. RCK, by contrast, was tall, good-looking and slim, the model, after all, for Victor Laszlo in Casablanca. François Duchesne, the biographer of Monet, identified him as Monet as lacking the politician's public talents. Well, RCK certainly did not. He had it in spadefuls. Just think of that second speaking slot straight after Churchill at the 1948 Congress in The Hague. Both of them were outsiders. Duchesne described Monet as fitting into a category of one. RCK also fitted into a category of one, just not the same categories, obviously. And so they both created at various points their own organizations around themselves. Pan-Europa, European Parliamentary Union for RCK, and for Monet Accuse. More of that anon. And another different, Monet had a permanent source of private income from his family cognac business, which was small, but gave him that income. RCK definitely did not. He depended on a little inheritance first and on his wife's earnings. And his wife's earnings as a very famous actress went up and down, huge amounts commanded, but then other time not so much. And then briefly, he was actually a professor at New York University during those 4 to 5 years in the war. Another contrast, Monet's home is a charming, modest house. RCK's only home in Switzerland, that one in which we showed you the photo, a large farmhouse, was bought by his wife and sold after her death. He needed the money. He lived mainly in the best hotels and elegant rented apartments, on the move, constantly networking, holding congresses and making speeches. It was a miracle that any correspondence reached him. And in fact, one had to say, each time he wrote, you could see a bit at the bottom saying, you can write back to me at, different address each time. Monet and RCK were rivals in the overview as well as in the detail. RCK would have argued that Monet shared his vision, Monet emphatically disagreed on this, so they couldn't even agree on what they disagreed. And this is evidence in their correspondence during the 1960s. I'll give you 3 examples. Jean Monnet, a typical civil servant's minute of a meeting which he held with RCK at 11 o'clock on the 5th of February 1964, and which he indeed says at the beginning was a very long meeting, he noted, and this is an English translation, I explained that we did not agree on a fundamental point, that whether some were or were not in agreement on the construction of Europe was not relevant today. What mattered was knowing how to do it, that the means, not the ends, were the priority. While the Count only wanted to discuss going from confederation to federation. The second example, in August 1966, a letter from Monet to RCK explaining that he couldn't go to his Congress. He never went to any of them, invited to them, and stated that I don't want there to be any misunderstanding between us. You know that on the important points we do not agree. Let's meet to discuss, he mediated that point. In September the same year, RCK wrote to Monet, ever optimistic, would like to have met, in quote, because our ideas on the union of Europe are never antagonistic, only minor questions separate us. You can see they had a totally different understanding of their relationship. And there were so many phone calls from RCK to Monet which were not taken. Monet was ill, or he had a cold, or indeed, at the extreme moment, a broken limb. This challenging relationship, it may date back to World War I. It may have started with Louis Michel, a strong supporter of Pan-Europe and RCK. What's happened is detailed in the book. Michel was enraged at Monet's shipping and supply control activity in London. And Monet rightly suspected Michel of trying to get him enlisted. Clemenceau sorted it. He remained in London. Looking now finally at the ideas they shared and where they diverge, I'm going to give you 2 examples. One from the Marshall Plan and one from de Gaulle. In the Marshall Plan, both Monet and RCK influenced the plan. Both were contradictory in their aims and both could demonstrate they'd been successful. For Monet, success was that the large amounts of money, funding, should head to the coal and steel areas in France. And RCK, as Martyn describes, that the funding to Europe should be coordinated and not nationalistic in approach. The divergence of their approaches, indeed their personalities, is illustrated in their USA activities. Monet, ever the diplomat and civil servant in the US, kept very quiet about his anti-Soviet views so that he got the early access to President Roosevelt. RCK, the promoter with his outspoken anti-communist views, had access only later to President Truman. And secondly, de Gaulle. Martyn calls it a strange relationship. And in a sense it was, in the sense that RCK was on the payroll while de Gaulle was president. Yes, but they addressed each other as mon cher ami. They corresponded a lot. And de Gaulle trusted his judgment on European matters. He told his advisors, does Coudenhove think it all right? If he does not, then it stinks. Monet had no friendship with de Gaulle. The only time they shared a common objective was in providing support for France in the Monet plan. After that, de Gaulle continued to put France first, Monet did not. Finally, the comparative high points in their careers. Duchenne argues that Monet's greatest years were between 1949 and 1955. It can be argued differently, as it is in the biography. Monet wielded considerable power during World War I. He was a young Deputy Secretary General of the League of Nations and active in Anglo-Franco relations in World War II. Not for nothing was he given the honorary British knighthood in the 1920s. Post-World War II, he sets up a COUS, Action Committee for the United States of Europe, and that's in 1954, whilst RCK revives Pan-Europa. Both had status in their organizations. Neither took up any role in the other. Monet refused one in Pan-Europa, and RCK was never asked. You could argue that the RCK high point was between the world wars. However, after World War II, RCK brokered the Franco-German reconciliation, 2 meetings of their MPs in Basel, January 1950, and in Rheinfelden 6 months later. As a result, RCK was awarded the Légion d'honneur from de Gaulle and the Bundesverdienstkreuz from Adenauer. Monet, the Charlemagne Prize, was the first 3 years after its first recipient, the Coudenhove-Kalergie. Both have streets and squares named after them, we saw a few. Monet has professorships. Both have prizes in their name. Merkel was an RCK recipient. Just to conclude, if I can. Julian Amery, son of Leo Amery, both RCK supporters and both British government ministers in their time. Julian wrote at his death in 1972, "It is given to few to dream great dreams and contribute to their fulfillment." You can argue, do we have fulfillment now in 2021? As for RCK, more important than trading relationship specifics was having the intellectual honesty to accept they would all have to form a single European confederation or even federation to survive in a hostile world. To reiterate Martyn's final point in his presentation, the debate in Europe today may be heading towards that discussion. And this is what makes publication of this biography of Hitler's cosmopolitan bastard, Count Coudenhove-Kalergie, and his vision of Europe so very relevant today. Thank you. Looking forward to the discussion and the questions.
Many thanks, Claudia, especially for going more into depth into the relationship and the interaction between Monet and Coudenhove-Kalergie, because I think many in the audience are particularly interested in this dimension, because many of us may be more familiar with Monet's ideas, and then you also wonder, well, what was the difference and why, to some extent, has Monet been more influential? And I'm sure this is going to come back in the Q&A session, because actually I have been receiving some questions in the meantime, and I also would like to encourage those who haven't sent questions yet to still do so. So there was the first question was by Ben Patterson, who asks to Martyn, you jumped over the Schuman Plan and the creation of the European Coal and Steel Community. What was CK's attitude to this and to the later Messina Conference? And perhaps Martyn, you may start, and I'm sure Claudia will also have to add something there.
Right, yeah, sure. Well, basically, he was rather upset. The Schuman Plan was announced about 10 days before he got the Karls Prize, the Charlemagne Prize, in Aachen. And he makes a passing reference to the thing in his speech. He delivered 2 speeches during the prize ceremony, one when he was awarded it, and then a public one from the balcony to the people in the square a little later in the day. And it's mentioned there as being a good step, a good idea. But manifestly, his nose was right out of joint. This is something that had come out of the blue. He knew nothing about it. And frankly, was never drawn into it. It would remain, the circle of people who knew about it before it was announced was in any case only a handful. A number of people in Germany knew about it around Adenauer, and probably all the Benelux countries, but not quite sure if all of them knew. And as you know, it was rejected in Britain. What he was concerned about really, or what bothered him at that time, were 2 other problems, although it sounds funny to see them in the same light. One of his problems was that just about that time, he was losing financial support from America. The American support team that he had and had securely in place since during the war, basically, changed from supporting him to supporting the European movement, led by Churchill, a bigger name, obviously, and arranged or fixed by Barrington Behrens, who was one of the people who went over for Churchill, along with Duncan Sands and I think Rettinger, I think at the time. I think that was the trio. And they managed to talk while Bill Donovan, who was in charge of the funds from the CIA, or was going to be the CIA, to backing the European movement and not backing the EPU. And that caused him a lot of trouble. I mean, there is subsequently in the archives a very strong letter from him to Donovan saying, basically, you've betrayed me. You've gone for an outfit which isn't committed to a federal state, to the United States of Europe. It is committed to something that moves in the direction of European unification, but has no idea, no worry about the time or the end destination. You know, it's not the same thing. We're the serious ones and you've gone for the wrong one. But that was the end, obviously, of that beautiful relationship. And at the same time, he realized he was not going to get any further with the EPU, and he eventually wound it up when Duncan Sandys, who had been his bête noire, something of a block between him and Churchill, when Duncan Sandys moved into government in 51 with Churchill, Spark took over the European movement, and Spark was much more friendly and on the same wavelength as RCK. And Spark organized the absorption of the EPU into the parliamentary wing of the European movement in exchange for RCK becoming one of the honorary presidents, up there with Churchill and all the others who were big political leaders. And he was terribly proud of this and wanted to show off the fact that he, never elected to public office, was in fact on a par with these people who were leading major countries in Europe. So in a sense, it took him by surprise. He never got back into the saddle of that particular horse, and it became Jean Monnet's horse, in which case he was always at 6s and 7s with Jean Monnet about it. Claudia, sorry, I've been on at length.
No. You. I think we should go back to talking about the SCC, the steel and coal community, and also I think Ben was also asking. I'm sorry, I'm reminding you probably about something else as well. I can't see what my writing says, but you can start on the SCC, on the ECSC.
Well, I think the ECSC, which is 50-51, I mean, the plan is there in 50 and it's 51 it starts, and Monnet gets the top job, which is, I'm not quite sure whether that was assumed before it started or just came out of the woodwork when it was really starting to move. But he obviously put his mark on it, put the stamp on the whole organization. And it was, surprisingly, when we look back historically, it was an organization with much more, crudely speaking, federal powers than subsequently the common market or even Euratom. And if anything, there was a weakening of the federal thrust during the subsequent 50s negotiation. And that was the biggest example of this, obviously, is the failure of the defense activity, the 54 vote, I think it's 54 and 55, the vote in the Senate that eventually kills it. It's been a long time dying because most of the others agreed it. I think all the others agreed it, but it took a long time before the French eventually said no. And that was very dear to Monnet's heart. It was a big disappointment to Monnet, and that probably gave a great boost to the activities of Accuse to get something more serious on the road, which meant the Messina negotiations, which meant Monnet and Spark rather than Coudenhove and Spark. That's probably where Spark had to make choices, but I don't really know enough about Spark to know quite how he rated these two figures.
Claudia, do you still want to add something, or shall I take
I was going to pick up on something which Martyn alluded to. We haven't developed in this particular presentation, and that was the relationship with Duncan Sandys. In the book, Duncan Sandys is a photo of him, and Martyn entitles it, I think he says, his nemesis. And it's because RCK always had this idea of being he really wanted to be an English gentleman. He said he had many nationalities inside him, regarded himself as a European patriot, but actually didn't have any British inside him. And he regarded both Churchill and Duncan Sandys at that point as the absolute epitome of English gentlemen. This was damaged when at one point before RCK went down to Geneva to talk to Churchill before the Zurich speech. He had a conversation with Duncan Sandys in his home in Group, and Duncan Sandys went to visit him there and gave him his list. Duncan Sandys promised him that they would be starting this new grouping, and RCK would be up there with Churchill, with Duncan Sandys in some slightly inferior role in this new movement. And in order to effect this, he really needed to have a list of all the people that this invitation should go to. And RCK gave him that list. And this is not the age of the internet. This is the age when you had to carefully accumulate all these details. And Duncan Sandys took that and then used it, in fact, to do the European Movement Initiative. And the second example, just a quick one, is that when RCK was invited eventually to that launch, having promised him that his flag would be up there, actually it was Duncan Sandys' flag, this E, this kind of inverted E, which was then called by both supporters and non, Sandys pants, was up there, and he was very shocked by that. And then the microphone also failed when he started to speak, and people were convinced that it was part of the conspiracy theory as well. There you are, a little aside, not quite in this area, but a little bit of colour.
Thank you very much for both your contributions. The next question is one by Richard, who asks, and he brings us well to the current period, why did RCK largely disappear from the public eye, and why is he not better known today? Well, of course, the book will change that, but so far that was not really the case. So, Martyn, do you want to?
Well, I think, to be fair, in more restricted circles, he is well known. I mean, there is a society for Coudenhove-Kalergie based in Vienna. It does have outreach. It does have an international membership. It's nothing like, as it were, the glory days of Pan-Europa. It's not 10,000 members and 16 branches in 16 capitals of Europe. It's not that sort of strength of movement, but there is certainly a residual concern for what Coudenhove did, which is a historical heritage, and in part for what Otto von Habsburg did when he succeeded him as president and shifted the bias of its work into democratizing Central and Eastern Europe. And I think probably he's better known there, perhaps, in some ways, even than in the West. But certainly in Austria and around Austrian concerns, there's quite a lively, a vif awareness of Coudenhove-Kalergie. And maybe in other places too. I think certainly in some academic circles, both German and French academics have written very well and quite extensively on him. I mean, the only thing I bring to this game, as it were, to this activity, is that this is the first English biography. It's because virtually none, well, very few of the sources, the good big sources, are in English. They're almost all written in German or in French, or sometimes in other languages, but nonetheless, German and French. And Claudia and I bring an awareness of those languages, and the output is in English, which is where the need is to know much more about Coudenhove-Kalergie.
Claudia, do you want to add something?
Only two small points. One is that until fairly recently, he was on the syllabus of schools in continental Europe, and certainly on the syllabus of universities studying European and international relations. I tried to find out from the Council of Europe if it was still the case, which proved a little bit of a challenge, actually. Not too sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I must say, when I was a student at the College of Europe, we studied Coudenhove-Kalergie, not extensively, but he was mentioned always in the historical courses, let's say, when as at the kind before the end of the Second World War, as one of the precursors of European integration, and as we also discovered together last week, and so there is also Coudenhove-Kalergie cohort in the College of Europe some years ago, so he's not entirely forgotten, but of course amongst the bigger public he's not so well known. There is a question by Benjamin Thorpe, who thanks both of you for the interesting presentation, and he would like to hear a little bit more about the sources that you have been using for the book, and also how you went about following the archival trail of CK.
Claudia, you first.
I start. Right. I look at it as concentric circles, really. We both started together on the primary research. I think the first time I went, I think Martyn was to the NOC. I got totally inspired by Martyn about this guy. He kind of just dropped this, and I was just fascinated. We then also, I carried on doing a lot of the primary research, partly because a lot of it is in the cantonal archive in Vaux, in Lausanne. Oddly enough, as you probably know, the Monet archives are also there. I still don't understand what they're doing in Switzerland, but anyway. And there's a lot of material there, carefully put together by one of the last Secretary Generals, Victoria Ponce, and we spoke to his son, lots of people we spoke to. Then the other source was the Churchill Archive, which was also amazing. There are other sources in Pilsen, probably Martyn, you will remind me, no doubt later, other ones we went to. So we saw a lot of primary material. It's very touching. I found it quite emotional to handle letters written by Winston Churchill to RCK, telling him that Great Britain had to be part of a European Union, capital E, capital U, in 1949. It's a short letter, it's in the book. So the primary sources, I think probably I can gently say the majority. Martyn read all his output, all of RCK's output. He read all of the output of everybody else related to RCK. read the tertiary. I mean, he read the primary, the secondary, the tertiary. I can't go beyond tertiary, I don't think. And I said to him a little while ago that I started, I think, with a greater understanding of the period. Martyn, I read it from one of my degrees. Martyn actually, definitely by the end, is much more aware of everything going on around it. So there's a mix. And we spoke to other people. So we spoke to the undertaker, we tracked him down, who told us he's a great mischievous man. And he sat there in his braces on the bench in his house and told us that he had signed the undertaker's certificate, the death certificate. As he died, RCK, in a clinic, spa clinic with doctors around. We were slightly mystified by this. We spoke with his relations, with his niece, a journalist, a very good journalist based in Vienna. We spoke with other relations. We spoke with his latest Secretary General in Austria, with a secretary in Vienna. So that's just a hint. We spoke to a lot of people. I managed to show the difference in our character personality. That I went and knocked on the door in Vienna at the Heiligen Kreuz Hall. Martyn stood back very concerned. And I said, the only thing they can say to us is, no, you can't come in. In the end, well, not in the end, they opened the door. It was a very nice young man and said, of course you can come in. And took us upstairs and showed us not only the apartment where they lived, which had a view onto the chapel, because it was the priors after all, and then also told us a story about when the Nazis seized the apartment. The valet, the thin valet, who was the husband of the fat cook, it was a lovely story, got into the dumbwaiter, which was the machinery which took things from the kitchen downstairs up into their apartment, went upstairs and retrieved a lot of his personal papers, including the bust of Napoleon, which was inscribed to him also as Ein Führer, not something you nowadays want to think about. So we talked to lots of people, we got lots of stories, and they're all in the book.
Yeah, the only bit I can just add on that is some of his the couple, Coudenhove-Kalergie himself and his wife Ida in particular, were incredible networkers, absolutely incredible. And as Claudia says, this was well before the internet and email. How they got it all into their lives and met all these people, I have no idea. But in a sense, you can pick up echoes of Coudenhove almost in any book of the time that you read. I was reading one or two published books by British correspondents who'd worked in or around Europe, and one of them devotes a whole chapter to Coudenhove-Kalergie with a full picture of him. He's a correspondent based in Paris, now totally unknown to the British public, and it's a second-hand book that I managed to pick up off the internet for other reasons, and found this chapter in there about Coudenhove-Kalergie, published in 1937, I think 37. And there are innumerable ones. Another one I very recently read, actually after writing the book, Sinclair Lewis, who's the first American prize winner for the Nobel Prize for Literature, married Dorothy Thompson, the very, very famous American correspondent, who was the first foreign correspondent expelled by the Gestapo in 1930, end of 33, beginning of 34, back to America, where she was a famous then commentator, very famous commentator, once described as the second most important woman in the country after Eleanor Roosevelt. And she was a personal friend of Coudenhove-Kalergie in Vienna before she went to the Berlin job. And they had both visited, both Ida and Coudenhove had visited her on the 27th of September 1929 in Berlin. And in this biography, there are the notes made by Dorothy Thompson of the conversation she had, first of all about the geopolitics with him, and then about the role of women in Germany with Ida. And she says how much more she got out of that conversation than the 1926 one she had with Ida, and she gives the date, when they met in New York on his first lecture tour to the States. And it's that sort of crisscrossing which is reflective of the incredible networking power that these people had at the time. Quite extraordinary picture.
Thank you, Martyn and Claudia. I think there are a couple of further questions who relate to the role of RCK today also. So what would RCK say about the European Union today? This is a question by Christian Surubaru. And how would you summarize his legacy? How would you translate and promote his ideas to students, young generations of today?
Well, I think, I mean, if I had to summarize it, I'd go back to Kissinger. Kissinger once famously said, I think it was for the Year of Europe, who do I speak to when I want to speak to Europe? And the problem is, in Coudenhove's terms, who leads Europe? Where is the center? Where is the control? Where is the power? What is there to project, and who projects it for Europe into the world? And then who is, in a sense, the arbiter, or what structure is the arbiter? We have an incredibly complex, very well balanced, evolving structure that we have had since ECSC. It's evolved until what we have now, the result of the Lisbon Treaty, minus Britain, which is a sad oddity, but that's the situation. And this strange balance is magnificent, but it's a bit like a multi-headed hydra. There are, is it 5 presidents still? Once I think there were 7, there are now 5. And one's never quite sure whether this is done by or run by or initiated by the Commission, or is it the Council, or does it require the Parliament or not, or is it a parliamentary initiative, or really is it a Franco-German deal, which will then be taken up by everyone else? All that is still very, very confused. And to Coudenhove, who was a very, very clear thinker, just read Pan-Europa. It is beautifully presented. One simple, straightforward thought after another. One point leads to another. And what we have for him is a muddle and a mess. And because of the muddle and the mess, we are weak. And in that geopolitical struggle, which he outlined beautifully across that map, just modernize it in your own minds, isn't it easy for China to say, well, it's a muddle and a mess. Who do we pick off first? Russia also almost can do that. And America is so closely interwoven with us that it's a different relationship with America. But they don't have that external role that both China and Russia have. But we are the object on the chessboard, not the player. And that's what he didn't want Europe to be.
Claudia, some additions, or views?
Only one really, just coming back. If you think about his legacy, I think for me, it is about being a European patriot. The idea that, I mean, he didn't belong really anywhere in that sense. He was Austro-Habsburg, the place disappeared. The Czechoslovakia, that also was different. He had a French passport. And he said when he came back, leaving on the bow of the ship that he landed, one of his trips back, that he really felt he was a European patriot. He belonged to the continent, not to a country. And I think if people now ask me, where do I belong? I say immediately I'm British and European. It's the first thing. The two for me go together. One doesn't negate the other. I could be a citizen of somewhere and nowhere, I think, possibly. That's a great personal view.
Thank you. Perhaps I would like to come back to the relationship with Jean Monnet, because we have discussed it at several occasions. And when, in the book, you also refer to the epitaph on his stump in Switzerland of RCK, and it's mentioned he's pionnier des États-Unis d'Europe. So, and perhaps for me, this is perhaps the core of the difference between Monnet and RCK, that RCK was really a believer in l'État-nation, and perhaps that also explains why de Gaulle was so fond of him, and also you mentioned that RCK supported the Fouchet proposals, which were exactly based on this cooperation among states, keeping out supranational institutions like the European Commission or a Court of Justice. And so, of course, for Monnet, the core of his ideas was, well, we also need supranational institutions who defend the European interest on their own and who can also stand up against the nation state. Would you not say that this is an important element in perhaps explaining also the differences between these two, and in that sense you cannot reconcile the ideas of Monnet and Coudenhove-Kalergie?
Well, I mean, I'll try to, but only in a dialectical method, right? If you take Monnet's position first, and then you see Coudenhove, and you mentioned the Fouchet plan, and obviously the having an intergovernmental structure over and above the supranational activities of the Commission, as it were, that would have been the general's view of this thing. If you look at those two, have to come out to something else in common after that. You need both. You need the intergovernmental because that can offer leadership. It's offered direct legitimacy and leadership. And that's where we wouldn't be talking about any sort of democratic deficit if that were not the case. The democratic deficit is not said to lie in the member states. If you look very closely, in some of them it's a bit dodgy, but nonetheless, in principle, we all know that each polity contains a politics and a demos. We're not quite sure about that for Europe, but we're on the way to changing it. And I would say that the synthesis that has to come out of what Jean Monnet stood for and what Coudenhove-Kalergie stood for, not contrasting them to negate each other, on the contrary, but saying you need most of what Monnet had and also most of what Coudenhove had. You need identity, you need leadership, you need legitimacy, in addition to having the structures which give you the supranational mechanisms that Monnet was strong on, very strong on. How you do it, I mean, I'm sorry, I don't have the answer. That's what the Conference on the Future of Europe is meant to decide, at least from the point of view of the private initiative sector. It's meant to be a more narrow, it's not a very broad investigation, as it were, but it will run for 2 years. And I think it has the chance to throw up some very, very interesting answers to some of these questions that I think the book is trying to put on the agenda.
Claudia, do you want to have some final words, or?
No, I think not. I think Martyn is right. I also think that RCK started at it, Monnet was driving it through the economic means, and he saw that as the way of through slow incremental steps, getting this buy-in from the countries. I love in his house, I really was sad that I didn't photograph all these bon mots which are up on the wall, of the wise ideas of how to get companies, how to get governments, how to get statesmen to work together in small steps. RCK really also was so clearly defined on the importance of not only cultural identity as European, as well as whatever small identity one had, but he looked at the much wider picture. And I don't think the two are a counterpoint actually at all, I must admit. So I share Martyn's view on this. Not on everything with regard to RCK, but definitely on this.
Thanks a lot. I see no further questions, and it has been a long day. So I would like to thank well, first of all, Tatiana Kaftea for helping us to organize this event, to thank the audience for the very interesting questions, and to thank Martyn and Claudia for an excellent discussion and very nice presentations. And I must say, I have read the book, and well, it's a very, very interesting, very, very well researched, but also very well written, I must say. So it is really a pleasure to read, and I think there your three careers, Martyn, as a journalist, academic, and civil servants come very well together. And I think also it's very rich in sources. So I think well, you did a very great job, both of you.
Thank you, Sophie.
Thank you very much. Put this on the list for our reading at Maastricht University.
Even better. Thank you very much. Grand. Great.